number one. What made you decide to focus on studying the parenting brain? And what is the parenting brain? Let's start with that question.
Yeah, so let's start with that question because it's so often I realize we're talking about the female brain or the parenting brain, but it's actually the brain. We all have brains, the same, very similar. In fact, all our brains are very similar. So it's how the brain changes essentially with parenthood. That's what I've been really interested in, and what happens in terms of the structure and the function of the brain. How does it change in order to learn how to parent? This is something that's been very interesting to me. And I actually got into this field even from a very young age. I grew up on a small farm, and I was very interested in how animals parented their young and animal behavior in general. And so it's really fascinating. I really love to watch animals.
Did you grow up on a farm?
Yeah, it was a small farm. And we had lots of animals. And so then I went to university and was interested in the intersection between hormones, brain, and behavior. And what better thing to study than to study that in the context of pregnancy and motherhood?
That's fascinating, right? Like, you grew up on a farm, you were around animals, you got curious about something, and then you got into this big field and having a conversation all over the world about the parenting brain. Do you know the precise moment where this is something that you realized that you wanted to do?
The precise moment? Here, there's my piano, and you can draw some keys. There you go. Almost hit it. I don't know if there was a precise moment. I definitely, and I was fortunate enough to have the option to explore different things, different research areas and things like this, and know what I didn't like to do. So I think for me it was often I knew that this, that was something I didn't want to do, but I was really enjoying. I've always been enjoying really this theme of parenting in the brain, and so that's something I've been passionate about, but in different contexts. So I do research, and I've done research in animal models, but then the science communication part and the sharing with the public has been, it came about, I kind of fell into it a bit. We wrote this review. I was asked to co-author this review in 2017, and on how the brain changes with postpartum depression and anxiety. And in fact, it got so much press and public interest that we were very surprised by this. But happy, of course, that this happened, and there was a conversation starting around this. And then from that, I was contacted by journalists and authors and podcasters, and started to realize the need to share the science of how the brain is changing with motherhood, with fatherhood, and parenting in general. And that's really where it started, is understanding that there was a need to know, and that so many people didn't know.
So, is there a difference between the male brain and the female brain?
Yeah. So it's all just the brain.
It's just the brain.
Let's just talk about brains. Our brains are much more similar between males and females, and they are different. And
okay.
I think that this is something that we have an issue with in our narratives about the brain. So our brains, if you look at, say, 1,000 females and 1,000 males, and you look at their brains, you'll probably be able to see some differences. But if you look at my brain versus my husband's brain, they're going to be fairly similar.
Fairly similar.
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason why I want to have this conversation on parenting brain is because, in our work at Bachpan Manao, and a lot of the work that we do across the ecosystem, and many, many organizations that work in this domain, constantly are dealing with issues of talking to parents about caregiving and effective caregiving and the roles of parental relationships. And in that context, is there something that happens in the mother's brain that is different from the father's brain during the period of motherhood or early motherhood as the journey begins? And what are the opportunities it's opening up for the mother, and what is it opening up for the father? Is there a difference? And if there is, what is it? If there isn't, what is it?
Right. So I think this is really a great question, and something we need to understand is, first of all, humans, we are alloparental, so biologically we should be interested in sharing the caring, essentially. And what we're seeing from the neuroscience research is that, yes, that does happen. Those changes can happen in mothers and fathers. They're different in a mother versus a father, particularly if the mother is the one who has been pregnant, because as you can imagine, the uterus changes, the baby's growing inside of you, there's a lot of physiological changes which can impact then, and we need more research on this, but the idea is, of course, that's impacting the brain changes. So we see more significant changes in the brain of a mother across pregnancy and the postpartum period, or between preconception across pregnancy, let's just say, than what you see in a father, definitely. But in terms of function of the brain, and really looking in the postpartum period, we can see that dads have everything in their brains to parent. Dads' brains can function in a very similar way to a mom's brain in response to infant cues. And this seems to have to do with experience and interaction with the child that can shape the response of the brain or the activity of the brain.
Of the father.
Of the father.
Of the parent, basically.
Of the parent or the mother. And so I think that this is really important to understand, because we often get focused on what's going on in mom's brain, because we get focused on the fact that, well, she's supposed to be the primary caregiver. And in fact, yes, okay, it's important to understand what's going on in her brain for various reasons, but we can't forget that actually the father's brain changes too. And it's, parenting itself and brain changes with parenting seem to be a function of that interaction, that learning. We're constantly learning how to care for the child.
So essentially what's happening is, if I hear what you're saying, and correct me if I misunderstood this, you're saying that the brain is physiologically changing so that it is creating space and opportunities for you to create new learning to parent.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to do it, to say it. So the brain, I like to think of it as if the brain is now becoming focused on learning how to care for that infant. And so we're not reinventing the brain, but what's happening is a lot of those brain circuits and brain areas we use every day, regardless of whether we're a parent. When we become a parent, especially in that early postpartum period, the research is showing that those brain areas become more activated in response to the child. They're kind of honed in on figuring out what to do with the baby, so we can learn how to do this. And it's a process of, it involves brain areas that are important for motivation and reward, because you want to find your baby rewarding and be motivated to care for it. And
what areas of the brain are that?
So that would be like the nucleus accumbens, for example, or the circuitry related to that, and dopamine. We've all loved talking about dopamine recently, but there's many different molecules in the brain that are important for parenting. So we see that, that's one of the pathways important. But of course, empathy, being able to understand the needs of others, emotion regulation, these are all very important. And also it's important to point out that we also need to be able to perceive cues from the environment. So there's that perception piece that's really important as well.
So basically, because when you read a lot of this writing on the idea of the mother's brain changing, or the parenting brain changing, and often enough people think it's the mother only, and you're saying it's not just, it's both. But at the same time, there is a tendency to think of it as becoming lesser somehow.
Yes.
But it's not really, is what I'm hearing you say. Is it may shrink, but it's actually opening up opportunities, is what I'm hearing you say.
So why don't I walk you through this a little bit. Just give you a summary of some of the key research findings to date from a number of different labs who are studying how the brain changes with parenthood. And so in the human literature, and I'll focus on that for today, we're seeing measurements of changes in size of different brain areas, and then measurements on changes in function of different brain areas. And this is a growing research area. In the past 5 years, it's really started to increase, which is great. But I want to just clarify a few points that I think are essential, based on the research since probably 2017. So when we're talking about structure, so this is brain size, gray matter volume. Gray matters are made up of neurons, for example. So they can measure whether it's changing in size. So these studies have looked across pregnancy and shown essentially the idea is that across pregnancy in a woman, the brain, different brain areas are shrinking, and these are brain areas important for social behavior. And so they shrink to about 1%, so they decrease in size, and everyone starts to get worried that they're losing their minds, right, when their brain is shrinking. But in fact, in that research has been showing that those brain areas, there's a relationship between the decrease in the brain areas and it's actually positively increased with feelings of sensitivity towards the child. So for me, I think of this as the brain is fine-tuning, it's becoming more efficient, it's getting rid of what it doesn't need at the moment to really hone in on what it's supposed to do. So this is structure, but of course structure isn't function. So function is a separate measure where function has to do with the activity of different brain areas. And functionally, a lot of the research has focused on the postpartum period when the baby's there, looking at how the brain is responding to baby, and that's where you often see a heightened response to a picture of your own baby, for example, than to others. So that's kind of the really brief story with regards to the maternal brain. But I don't want to leave out the paternal brain, a father's brain. So I also want to add that a father, there's been some really nice research showing that dads' brains also shrink. So not to the same degree, of course, but there is this, again, fine-tuning, and this is related to his involvement with the child in this recent research, and I think that's really important to remember that there is a fine-tuning of his brain. And then functionally, there's been more research with regards to function of a father's brain. There's lots of different changes that can occur. It's very similar to what you see in a mother in terms of activity and response to infant cues. And some of this research has really been nice because it's been showing that it has to do with a father's involvement. And so there's this need to interact with the child, and that kind of shapes the parental brain, essentially, or shapes how the brain is responding to the child and makes the brain parental, if we want to say that.
So if I understand that correctly, and you're essentially saying that when there is motivation to interact, or to spend more time, or do things, or engage more, if there's intent.
Part of me also thinks you don't necessarily need the motivation, you just have to start by doing.
You just have to do something.
Yeah, why not, right? I mean...
you just do it. You don't need anything deeper than that. You just do something.
Well,
you just start engaging.
Just start doing something. And see what happens. I think sometimes I think of this as babysitting, for example. Sometimes we didn't necessarily know what we're doing or feel like we wanted to do this. Granted, fathers, I will say to everyone out there, are not babysitters, they're parents.
Yes.
But it's that idea of, you have to learn how to respond, and you might not be overly motivated. I think a lot of people who aren't around babies, a lot of parents, they're kind of scared of what could happen. That's really normal response, especially for fathers. A lot of fathers struggle with anxiety, and if they're doing it right, but they don't talk about it. And so I think it's really important just to start. You might feel like, but I shouldn't, I'll drop the baby, I don't know what to do. But you have to learn, you have to build confidence. There's many different right ways to parent, healthy ways to parent, and go for it. And so that's the one piece is I really think fathers engage, do this, start somewhere, but also moms, let them sort it out. Give them baby and walk away for 20 minutes.
Allow the bonding to happen.
Allow this whole experience, and it might, the first time might be, who knows, not as fun as the second time, but you have to give the opportunity.
You have to give the opportunity for learning. So if I had to think about a takeaway from this conversation, while we can continue this in many different ways, and we are going to do that over the course of the year and hopefully more, it would be to see this whole time period as an opportunity of rewiring and fine-tuning of brain and body, and to give space for both.
Absolutely. I think that's it.
That's essentially it.
Yeah, that's essentially it.
And to know that our brains are actually reshaping and forming should give us more confidence that we should do more.
And we have everything in our brains to parent.
To parent.
Yeah, all of us do.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.